statistics that Britain lost, as usual, as in every year, that in fact Britain lost around 1% of cases taken to the European Court. So the European Court last year rejected as inadmissible over 80,000 applications from all over Europe and made judgments in around just over 1,000 cases. So this image of a war on British justice in particular is totally without statistical foundation. And despite how prevalent that image is, because of cases involving prisoner vote, because of scandals dredged up by the Lord Chancellor and various Conservative Party people, and it's a fantasy, it's a victim fantasy, is what I've called it elsewhere.
They're doing this just because it's suiting their policy at the moment, to create a bit of a stir about Europe, don't you think?
Yeah, I think it suits them in a range of respects. It distracts from the situation in the economy. It deals with backbench Tory party, which is arguably far more Eurosceptic now than it was during the splits and disasters that consumed John Major during the early part of the 1990s. And Cameron is in a terrible position. I mean, also, it would be important to note that Cameron is himself a very Eurosceptic kind of character, that he's not a kind of secret Ken Clark figure. That he empathises, maybe not to the full extent of your Dan Hannons and such, but he's on that wing of the party.
It's actually strange why they want out, though, because economically, a lot of the EU is as neoliberal and right-wing economically thinking as the fringes of the Conservative Party and the Farages of this world. So it's kind of strange that they want out in that way. So it must simply be, is it simply kind of hatred of foreigners? We don't like Johnny Foreigner telling us what to do, so we've got to get out. Like, most of the things that they actually stand for in terms of economics are represented at the European Commission. The Commission, although Court of Human Rights is not part of that and all of that, but why they want out is actually a mystery to me as well.
Well, but they don't. I mean, that's what the kind of the mainstream Tory thinking from even your very Eurosceptic ministers like William Hague is that they don't want out of the EU. They want to be part of a common market, but the provisions that they object to in terms of European law, which is very complex and has lots of different limbs in terms of competition law and so on, are generally about the common market. I think that there's a fundamental curiosity that if you listen to the Conservative rhetoric, you'd think that they wanted out of the EU, but that actually isn't their position. And that's why I think David Cameron's argument is so problematic, because it's premised on this renegotiation, which has to involve every single member state in the European Union, which is 27 member states, which is a very substantial body of diplomatic endeavour to get any sort of fundamental amendments to these treaties. And there's lots of literature on the backgrounds of the various different iterations that there have been of the European Union. But I think that's also the problem that he'll face if it comes to a vote. So say by some happy chance, from his point of view, he achieves a certain renegotiation because his European allies want to give him a fig leaf and want to keep Britain in the EU, which I expect they would do. It's going to be quite difficult for him to vault face and say to the British people through the medium of I think, pretty overwhelmingly Eurosceptic press that actually this new compact with Europe is the bee's knees. And that's what he's going to have to do. And it's going to be a big political challenge if it even is in the favourable circumstance that I was envisaging. And chances are it won't be, because chances are he probably won't achieve a renegotiation.
One part of me seems to think that they're just hoping there's a lot of votes in this foreigner bashing. What you said earlier, it's to distract from the economy. It's always a standard tactic. Okay, don't look here, look there. It's like you said you were a big fan of The West Wing in another episode. I was always a huge fan of Yes Minister. I can almost quote every episode to you. And I loved the one, Sir Humphrey, if the public don't know what you're doing, then they don't know what you're doing wrong. And it's just, it could be as simple as that. Look there, don't look here. I'm not sure. Are there as many votes in foreigner bashing as they're hoping? I don't know.
Well, I mean, it's an old political strategy, isn't it? Externalizing the threat, and it's got a Holyrood tradition in Britain, particularly in its relationship with Europe. That kind of rhetoric and that kind of satisfying distraction. As I was saying earlier, I really don't actually think that there's such a big constituency in the country for high-level Eurobashing, because people care about things that impact more on their lives, and there are lots of things that the EU does which impact substantially on people's lives. I mean, lots of our labour market provisions, our non-discrimination provisions, our working hour provisions that we have in this country and protection for workers derive from the EU.
Well, that's the left-wing argument about staying in that I was talking about before.
Yeah, and you don't hear that, and we don't hear that argument made very often. So I didn't want to sort of imply that the EU doesn't have an impact on individual lives. It has done and will do in the future quite substantially. But I don't think that it's such a level of remote agreement in terms of, when people go on holiday, and I'm of the generation that started going on holiday just before the EU kind of got fully into the free movement of persons before the euro. But it's quite easy to take for granted these kind of basic structures that when you go to Spain on your holidays, when you go to the France or whatever, or Italy, those kinds of considerations. It's quite easy to forget them. And there are certainly arguments, I suppose, that the people who are pro-EU would come to make in this referendum process. But I think it's really overstated how salient EU issues are for the general public. It's about jobs, it's about the services people rely on, and if you look at polling, I mean, you very rarely see the EU even sort of towards the top 10 of issues that punters would identify as the kind of essential ones for them in terms of thinking about how they vote.
Yeah, also the way it's portrayed in some of the media is ridiculous. Like, one of the most famous stories about the EU is the thing about the bananas, if you remember this. And this must take some of the blame about why people bash the EU constantly. I think there's other good reasons to criticise it and other good reasons to support it. But for example, that story with the bananas, I'd just like to put this on the record. That was so famous, but it was utter bollocks from start to finish. The official story was, not the official story, the story in the newspaper, I think we can guess which one, said EU new laws, bananas must be straight. They must have a certain straightness, or they will not be accepted to be sold in European countries. And this story became famous, and everyone talks to the EU. They say, oh, bananas, that is ridiculous, the bureaucracy. What that was actually about was nothing of the sort. What happened was they had a law to change it because France wanted to support its former colonies. So instead of importing bananas from Jamaica, the West Indies, that kind of region, they moved it to an area of Africa that was a former colony of France, and the bananas that come from there are a slightly different kind of banana and were a different shape. And then somehow this miraculously appears in the media as bananas must be straight, EU bureaucrats gone mad. And it's, when that's the kind of standard of reporting, it's not surprising that there's a fundamental misunderstanding sometimes about what the EU actually does.
No, I think that's definitely true, and there's also, I mean, they seem esoteric. Another classic example, I'm pretty sure it was the European Court of Justice was assessing whether Jaffa cakes were cakes or biscuits for the purposes of VAT. Because one was exempt from it and the other one wasn't, and it was, and these legal disputes seem esoteric, and they are substantially. I mean, it's amazing to think that we educate people to such a high degree to discuss such apparently arcane questions, but they are how common markets work. I mean, these agreements on funny little finicky legal things and with particular diplomatic and political resonances are kind of how complex institutions, governments of the sort actually work. I mean, one of the examples that I heard being discussed was in the context of this equal marriage legislation going through in England, and one of the provisions of English law, if you're going to get married, is that you can have your marriage nullified in England on the ground of non-consummation. If himself cannot fulfil his husbandly duties, then the marriage is potentially invalid, or you can render it invalid. So the question was, if you have a same-sex partnership, what is consummation?
Sorry.
I know, it's just ridiculous. But like, Home Office lawyers were spending days and days deliberating sagely on a range of sexual activities and deciding which would count as consummation or not. Now, that seems daft, but actually that's the kind of the bureaucratic reality of operating within law and within states and within institutions like the EU. No one would say because of that rather eccentric example about consummation that equal marriage is a bad thing, or that government itself is probably something we should forgo. I don't think so. The same for me is true about the EU, that actually it may have these eccentric features and occasional manifestations, but actually they're often in service of something which makes a lot more sense if you don't just read what the Daily Mail tells you about it.
Yeah, well, it's probably more fun than they have in the Home Office normally. But uh, okay, so the Tories are wanting Devo something from Europe, but the Devo something or Devo blah is back on the menu in Scotland.
Yes, yes. So, well, there's been a few spurs to this week. That the IPPR published a report by Alan Trench, who's a kind of respected academic, smart guy, and he was writing about Devo More, is what he was been calling it, and it's about the financial structures that they might introduce with more devolution to devolve more financial powers to Scotland. And Alan was UCL is attached to the University College London, their Constitution unit, and the IPPR is quite close to the Labour Party, which is internally discussing potential more devolution. And as some people might have noticed this week, Ruth Davidson gave a speech entitled For Scotland, where she said that she's been looking at America and North Carolina.
On a map or something?
She's been deliberating on its sort of constitutional features, and has decided that her remarks before she was elected Conservative leader, that there was a line in the sand that she would not cross, and that line was the Scotland Act that was agreed in 2012 on the basis of the Calman Commission proposals. She's changed her mind. Now she's in favour of yet another discussion about Devo something. I don't know what she has in mind, and certainly Alan Cochrane, that black-hearted unionist, was very critical of her in the Telegraph today, saying basically that he hadn't the foggiest what the devil she was talking about.
Stirrings in the interior of the Tory party?
Well, I think from her point of view, she was elected as the Conservative Party candidate for leader in Scotland that was the least devolutionary disposed. Darth Murdo Fraser, as I like to think of him, he was the kind of candidate who was advancing a more explicit commitment to more devolution, thinking about fiscal autonomy much more seriously. And you can certainly envisage, I think, a right-wing argument for why it would be important for Holyrood to take on these kind of powers. But what interests me about this whole debate, whether we're talking about the Liberal Democrats and their federalism proposals, or the rather vague and a bit, I think, still reasonably unconvincing sort of loose proposals emanating from the Tories and from the Labour Party, is how do nationalists react to this? Because on one interpretation, what this is doing, all of these Devo something chatter, is saying, well, if you vote no, then it means this, it means Devo something. And if you vote yes, it means independence. And thus far, the SNP, the Yes campaign, have tended to sort of poo-poo the whole prospect of more devolution and say it's just not going to happen. And what interests me is what happens to nationalist pro-independence discourse if it becomes convincing, if they put the work in, if they make commitments, if they advance systematic proposals, those that are opposed to independence. How do we change the debate? What do we do?
I think the case would be if the more devolution extends to having all the economic powers, then why not just go whole hog? I mean, you're 99% there. In that case, why not just jump the other 1%? What's the difference? That could be the possible idea. Yeah. But I can see why the SNP would be very, very cynical about it. These could all be promises. And then, look at what Cameron's done with the EU vote. That's got to be, 5 years down the line or something? And it could be, it could be to go back to Yes Minister, it could be the standard Sir Humphrey, we've commissioned a report, it will come back in about 8 years. it will suggest basically the status quo once everyone's forgotten about it. So I can understand exactly why the SNP would be cynical about any kind of promises of further devolution. But yeah, to answer your question, I think it's quite clear what the strategy would be. If they're saying, all right, you're going to have this, and this extra power, then they would just say, well, why not? Why don't we just jump the extra bit? What's the difference?
Yeah, I think one of the I think you're right, just to pick up on your point about skepticism about these proposals, and I think that I wrote something this week about why there are lots of grounds to be intensely skeptical. Not least the fact that the Scotland Bill, on the basis of the Calman proposals, but not entirely fulfilling what Kenneth Calman and his commission proposed, in every particular. That actually you had a fairly recent opportunity for the Labour Party, for the Liberal Democrats, for the Conservative Party, if they believed in their bowels, according to their ideology, that these powers ought to be devolved, they had an ample opportunity, and they didn't do it. So I'd like to hear a